The whole thing just doesn't make sense to me. Like, that wouldn't have made me safer and it wouldn't have healed me. And so I think a lot of times there's this like idea when I approach the work that like, I'm just trying to free bad guys. And that's not it at all. I just want systems that actually work. If the goal is to keep us safe, what we're doing isn't working. So let's look at another way. We've done this version long enough. Alaska still has one of the highest rates of sexual assault, domestic violence, opioid use, alcohol abuse, suicide. And we just keep trying to incarcerate our way out of that problem. It's not working.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is Megan Edge, the Prison Project Director at the American Civil Liberties Union of Alaska. At age 19, Megan got her first job in a newsroom, and she worked for 7 years covering local Anchorage issues, state politics, military affairs, the Iditarod, and most relevant to today's conversation, crime and courts. In 2017, she left the news business to work in Governor Bill Walker's administration as the Department of Corrections Public Information Officer. Her eyes were open to many of the problems in Alaska's prison system. To be able to understand our conversation today, we will refer to ACC several times. ACC stands for Anchorage Correctional Complex, which is located off 3rd Avenue in downtown Anchorage. We also refer to Goose Creek Correctional Facility, and that's at Point McKenzie, about an hour's drive from Wasilla, and Spring Creek Correctional Facility, Alaska's maximum security prison located near Seward. Megan Edge, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Tell us a little bit about yourself. Where'd you grow up? What was your childhood like?
Sure. So I'm born and raised right here in Anchorage. I think I'm a typical Alaska baby. My dad came up here in the military, which is how so many people end up here and their families do. My mom ended up in Alaska when she was a kid because her dad was in the military. So that's how we got here. And I'm a product of the public school system. I actually graduated from Save High School. Save High School is a sort of alternative learning program for the public school here in Anchorage. Kids that have different sort of behavioral problems. It's what I might call like a last resort school where they're really just trying to get you graduated. So I started going there about halfway through my senior year, and it saved my whole life and the trajectory of my future. So I'm super grateful to Save.
So I'm assuming that you didn't have the greatest high school experience?
No, I'm dyslexic. So learning was always a challenge for me. And yeah, I think it's really easy to get lost in a public school system. I had challenges like reading and writing, and I got through some of those. But yeah, once I went to high school, it was a game changer for me. I went to service. I grew up in the South Side, and yeah, Save was where I needed to go. And as I've gotten older and I work with the population of people that I do, I think a lot of times about how important programs like Save or Benny Benson or Whaley, which are really, I think, overlooked a lot of times when we're talking about public education, because I know for me, it really saved my life. And I'm super grateful. Like, I never thought I would graduate. So to be where I am now and to have this platform and this power to try and make the world a little bit better for everybody else and make sure that there is a place for everyone in the world, it's a really full circle moment for me.
Were you diagnosed with dyslexia when you were young?
I actually wasn't diagnosed with dyslexia until I was an adult. I never got tested for it, but in my early 20s, I started to do some mental health work on myself, and that revealed quite a few things for me. And one of them was that I was dyslexic, and it just, oh my gosh, it made my life make so much more sense to me.
I assume I have a child who's dyslexic, that it took you a lot longer to read things.
Oh, it took me a lot longer to read things. I had a teacher, and she was my teacher in the 3rd and 4th grade, Miss Gerard, and I was just an awful reader. I felt it made me feel stupid, and so I didn't want to do it. I would get behind in my classes, and she just set up reading and learning programs that were really helpful for where I was, and now I read all the time.
You became a journalist.
I became a journalist. I read and write for a living.
So you graduated from Save.
I graduated from Save.
And then did you go straight to college or what?
Yeah, I didn't want to go to college because I just felt like I really wasn't smart enough to go to college. And when you graduate from Save, basically everybody there graduates with a 2.0, a C average. Their grading system is a little bit different. And I didn't want to go to college because I was like, I'm just going to do bad at it. I'm stupid. And my mom was very much, you just have to go and try. I think it's going to be a very different kind of learning for you. And I had some really wonderful teachers that really made me want to be in school. The chair of the journalism department, Paula. There's an English professor, Don Reardon, who's written a couple books, and I was in his class when he was publishing his first book, and that was so exciting to me. So I went to UAA and I started working at the student newspaper. And then by the time I was 19, I was working in a newsroom.
When did you graduate from high school?
2010.
2010. And did you know, had you been interested in journalism before? It just seems like somebody who doesn't like to read, like, I'm curious about how that happened.
My brother was studying journalism at UAA, and he was like the managing editor for the student newspaper, the Northern Light. And the student newspaper office is in the main student union right next to what at the time was Subway. I don't know what it is now. And they were looking for writers and sports writers. And I grew up an athlete. So I was like, I could write about cross-country running or basketball. And so he let me start writing stories. It paid like $12 an hour. It fit with my school schedule. And I got paid to watch sports and write about it. But I actually learned so much about writing and collecting information. And the student media program at UAA, I think sometimes be really overlooked, but it was a wonderful experience for me. And it taught me some of the most important lessons of my life. I'm really grateful that I went to the program, but my brother is what inspired me to do it. And then I started reading a lot of Hunter S. Thompson, and I got a subscription to the New Yorker. And I just started to really understand what like the power of the pen could do.
And is your brother still a journalist?
My brother's not. My brother does communications for GCI. Yeah, we both left journalism about the same time. He started working for GCI, and I got an offer to work for the Walker administration.
And you worked for Department of Corrections with Walker administration.
Yeah.
I guess you said when you were 19,
Yeah.
you were working in a newsroom.
Yeah.
Was that Alaska Dispatch News?
So actually, I worked at the CBS affiliate, Channel 11 first, and then I liked it, but like I said, I was getting really into kind of like dissecting the importance of journalism, and I felt I really wanted to be a strong writer, and I just wasn't going to get that working in TV news. And so Alaska Dispatch had a really low-level calendar editor position open, so I talked to the managing editor, and I did their calendar, and I pitched stories, and that really advanced my journalism career.
And you kept going to school?
I stopped going to school. It is hard to pay rent and bills and go to school full-time and work full-time. And I do have I think there's part of me that has some regrets about that. But quite honestly, though, I'm very happy with how my career has gone. And I'm very grateful that I have gotten a lot of opportunities without a college degree. But I definitely have a little bit of like an imposter syndrome because I don't have one.
You went to Alaska Dispatch News, you had that calendar position, and then it advanced
to a reporter position. And then Alaska Dispatch News bought the Anchorage Daily News. We combined. And then I got an offer to go back to TV news, but I got the offer to cover the Iditarod. And I had never got to do that as a reporter. And it's a journalist bucket list in Alaska. So I got to spend a couple of years on the Iditarod Trail, chasing dogs. And that was a really cool opportunity too, because I got to see really beautiful communities and parts of the state that are really hard to get to. They're not common to go to. There isn't hotels or restaurants. So you really have to be supported by the community to be there. And I definitely would not have been able to see those places without that opportunity.
How did you go from that to getting offered the job in the Walker administration?
It's a small town. There were a couple of people working under his administration who were former journalists. And one was leaving Department of Corrections, and they offered it to me. And I was really at this weird point in my life also because I was applying for jobs in the lower 48, journalism jobs. I just wanted to change. And so I was going through that process, and then my mom got sick. She was diagnosed with stage 4 brain cancer, and it was a terminal diagnosis. And so suddenly all these like big dreams I had of going other places, I was like, well, I'm not doing that. Like, I'm a mama's girl. I'm going to stay right here close to home. But I definitely still wanted to change. And so I got offered to take the public information officer job for Department of Corrections during this criminal justice reform era. And I was like, I don't know if I want to work in prisons, but at the end of the day, I still really wanted to be a writer. And I feel like to be a really good writer, you have to understand people. And that opportunity to work for corrections, I thought would give me a better insight into people and why they do what they do. But I really underestimated how much I would learn about my state, my community, and just people when I took that job. I've learned way more about the world doing this work than I ever thought I would, which is part of the reason that I've stayed in it.
And did your mom pass away?
My mom did pass away. My mom passed away while I was working for the Department of Corrections. And when I told people that I was going to work for DOC, I got a lot of people that are like, why would you do that? But you have to understand that, like, I was a cops and courts reporter. A lot of young journalists you cover at the time, you can't really anymore, but you chase police scanners, you're down at the courthouse all the time. And part of the reason I wanted to leave journalism or leave it here was because I felt like I was writing the same story over and over again with just like a different name and a different number. And I was a little bit restless in that because I was actually in a trial for someone that I went to high school with. I wasn't friends with him, but I went to high school with him, and he was convicted of murder. And when they convicted him of murder, his mom let out this really horrific scream and passed out in the courtroom, and the judge had to clear the courtroom. And I wasn't particularly fond of him when I was in high school. And so going into the trial, I definitely probably had a little bias, and I had no warm, fuzzy feelings for him. But that was a really important experience for me, and it's what made me restless as a journalist, because I started to realize that crime and criminal justice is so much more complicated than there was a crime that happened, there was a bad guy, there was a victim, then there was a hearing, and then it's over. Like, it's so much more complicated than that. And no one was really asking these questions about, like, why did you do that thing? Why did you take that person's life? And so I was really wrestling with it, and I got this job to work at DOC, which was great. And then so people were asking me, like, why would I take that job? And I was like, I just want to understand the system. And so my mom was sick at this time, and she was really the only person who thought I wasn't absolutely batshit crazy for taking this job.
She supported you.
She very much supported.
So you took the DOC job, and your mom passed away while you were there.
Yeah, my mom passed away while I was there. Like I said, my mom had stage 4 brain cancer, and I watched my mom die over the course of about a year and a half. And with her diagnosis, she really lost her speech. She would lose thought, or she would have an idea on the tip of her tongue, but she couldn't figure out the word to say. And so it was really hard, I think, for people to have conversations with her. And then there's also this like whole thing that like you're dying and no one really knows what to say. And I just wanted her to feel normal, like as normal as you could possibly feel. So for me, normal was talking about what my day was like, which was spending a lot of time in prison. And one of the very last conversations that I had before my mom lost her speech entirely was she asked me about the Spring Creek Boys, which were a group of inmates that were doing restorative justice work that I was working with a lot, which I thought was honestly really nice that she asked how they were. She had been paying attention and she knew their names. And then she told me to keep making the world a better place. And that was really the last conversation I had with her. And so I look at where I'm at now and what I'm doing, and I feel like I would have done her proud. I feel like she would be super proud. And yeah, so like the work was really emotional for me too, because I dealt with the grief of her passing by really just like going back to work. And I went to Spring Creek. My mom died, like I think on a Thursday, and I went to Spring Creek the next Monday. And I hadn't been down there for a little while. We were working on the podcast, and I hadn't been down for a while. And the guys working on the podcast were giving me crap for not coming down, and it was all in good fun. And then I was like, well, I'm sorry, but my mom just died. And none of them even knew my mom was sick. And because it was my position, like when I go into prison, it's not really about me or my bullshit. But I told them my mom was sick. And they were so sad for me that I had to experience it. And as sad as that moment was, it was also an eye-opening experience, because here are a group of men who've all done these really horrible things. And if you were just to Google their name, you'd probably be really terrified of them. But monsters don't have that sort of care and concern for somebody. And it showed me just how complicated people are, and that people are not only the worst thing that they've ever done. They can still be good, and they can still be loving, and they can still be caring and empathetic. And I was really grateful for their kindness in that moment, because I very much needed it.
And you mentioned that guy that you'd gone to high school with who was found guilty of murder, and his mom screaming. Can you just talk a little bit more about what his mom screaming meant?
She just lost her baby too. He had done a really horrible thing, but at the end of the day, he was still somebody's baby, and somebody who was still loved. And I think it's really easy when you read criminal complaints or you sit in a courtroom or you just read what's in the newspaper. I think it's really easy to look at somebody and not see them as a human after they've done something like that. But even in that moment, she knows what he did. She knows it's really horrible. And to his mother, he is still so worthy of love. And that's still her baby. And what it made me realize was that there are so many more victims. It's not just the life that he took and her family. It's them and his own family. I was at a banquet down at Wildwood in October, which is where he actually is housed right now. And that was the first time actually that I had seen his mom since that trial. And it was such, I don't know, a really nice moment for me to see them loving and interacting and playing games and just having this kind of normal moment. And his mom's still by his side and they're adjusting to whatever this new normal is. But yeah, it makes you realize that like people are complicated, and when bad things happen, they have such a big impact in ways that are hard to understand until you see it. Because in that moment, somebody who I looked at as horrible, and that I'm looking at him that way, but this other person in the room is just seeing her broken baby. And I don't think that's wrong.
What do you say to people who say you're sympathizing with the wrong people? What about the woman that he murdered and her family?
I'm sympathizing with everybody. I think people can be accountable for the bad things that they do and still be worthy of humanity and dignity and love. I feel horrible for what happened to her family. It was an absolutely horrible crime. And I also feel horrible for his mother, who's now has a relationship with her son through the telephone and in the control of the Department of Corrections. I don't think any parent wants that. And I just don't believe that most parents, I'm not a parent, but I have a hard time believing parents, the best or the worst, ever bring life into this world and think, I hope he does something horrible. I don't think any parent, I think that should be a parent's worst nightmare.
I know this just because I've listened to other podcasts where you've talked about it, but you've been the victim of a crime before.
Yeah. I think it's a lot of what drives me into this work and how I prioritize things. I was sexually assaulted at a party when I was in high school, and I did not report it because I was a teenager. I wasn't supposed to be at this party. I was drinking, and I didn't see myself as a good victim. And
meaning that you thought in some way that because you were misbehaving that
I could just, I know what it is to be I know, well, not necessarily that, but I know what it is to be a woman in this world. And there's so much dialogue where if you don't want to be sexually assaulted, don't wear those boots, don't wear that outfit, don't be in that place, don't drink that much alcohol. And I've seen friends report crimes to police officers, whether that be sexual assault or domestic violence, and officers to be very dismissive. At that point, most of my understanding of the criminal legal system is what I watched on TV, but I knew there was such thing as a good victim and a bad victim, and I probably wasn't going to be a good one.
That it was going to be easy for a police officer to dismiss.
Absolutely. So yeah, I was sexually assaulted, and it's a brutal reality and truth in my life that sometimes I think that I've really healed from, and then I find myself triggered. But I think about it a lot in the context of what I do now, because I don't feel safe walking down 4th Avenue at 2 a.m. by myself. I don't feel scared, but I'm cautious. I'm always looking around at my car keys between my fingers. And I think about it a lot now because I think the whole reason I started the prison project with the ACLU was I wanted to do good in the world. I wanted to be able to continue to make Alaska a place that I love. I've spent my whole life here. I wanted to make it a better place, but I also just want to be safe. And I want people, my friends, to stop having these really traumatic experiences with violence. And what I learned when I worked at DOC was that DOC wasn't going to fix that problem. I was sexually assaulted by a young man who I was friends with, who came from a really terrible home with a mother who had a massive addiction problem, a single mother who did lots of horrible things to feed her addiction to the cost of her children. And then he perpetuated those harms onto me. And it was one of the worst nights of my life. I have nightmares where I'm like back in that moment. I don't condone what he did. I would like an apology at some point in my life. I don't know if that's achievable. I got into my early 20s. I really started thinking about the fact that I never reported what happened to me. And I started to feel a lot of guilt and a lot of fear around, oh my God, what if he did this to somebody else? And then I started working for DOC. And I realized that DOC probably wouldn't have helped either one of us. There's nothing that he can do to undo what he did. I would like an experience in my lifetime where I can confront him with what that moment did to me. And I would also just like an apology. I would like an assurance that he has not continued that behavior. And if that is something that he's continued, I want him in therapeutic treatment. And what I learned when I worked at the Department of Corrections was there is a list a mile long for people who need sex offender treatment, and there's only a slight sliver of access to that program. And we have prisons like Spring Creek or maximum security prison that have people there that are sex offenders. In Seward. Yeah, and there's people there who are sex offenders. And there's almost no sex offender treatment there. And those are people that'll still get out of the system. And so I realized that if he had been there, I don't know if it would have made him any better. And the other thing, the sad reality is, as a survivor of sexual violence, when I see sexual violence happening to other people, I don't care what the setting is, I find it absolutely appalling. And there's a lot of it that's happening inside of prisons. And the people most likely to be sexually assaulted while they're in prison are people who are convicted of sexual assault. And so looking at this kid that I know and putting him in that setting, what would have happened to him if he ended up there at 17 or 18? And there's a good chance that he would have also been sexually assaulted. And then we give him a felony, make him a victim. But the whole thing just doesn't make sense to me. Like, that wouldn't have made me safer and it wouldn't have healed me. And so I think a lot of times there's this like idea when I approach the work that like, I'm just trying to free bad guys. And that's not it at all. I just want systems that actually work. If the goal is to keep us safe, what we're doing isn't working. So let's look at another way. We've done this version long enough. Alaska still has one of the highest rates of sexual assault, domestic violence, opioid use, alcohol abuse, suicide. And we just keep trying to incarcerate our way out of that problem. It's not working, which is fine. We tried it. It's not working. And that's fine to acknowledge. Let's figure out a way to do it more efficiently and make us actually safer, create healthier people.
When you were working for DOC under the Walker administration, do you have conversations about this with people?
They were like my friends and stuff, because it forced me to process that trauma, which I had just tried to push to this like deep, dark place. But when I was contemplating taking the job, I did a lot of thinking about, am I going to be super triggered? Because I'm going to be interacting with people who are convicted of sex crimes. Is that going to be scary for me? And I'm not going to say that I was always comfortable. I definitely wasn't, but I never felt like I wasn't safe. And so having a space to confront things that was safe was actually very healing for me. To me, it was very much like a traditional Indigenous practice of a healing circle. The circle doesn't heal till everyone's sitting down at it. So I've been avoiding this group of very scary people because I was afraid of them, and I think that's justified. But I got more healing out of having to be in spaces with them where we were being really honest with each other about our experiences. And so I didn't talk about it a lot. It took me some years to process because I just tried to not address it at all. And that forced me to start processing it.
How did that job with DOC lead to your work at the ACLU?
Yeah, well, I saw how the correctional system could function to the better and to the benefit of all people interacting with it, whether that be the people that are housed there, the community, the staff, if we try to do some things different. Let's take a place like Spring Creek in Seward. Spring Creek, when I worked for the Department of Corrections, was doing some of the most innovative and successful changes to how we run our prisons. They created step-down programs for solitary confinement that could safely reintegrate people who had been in long-term solitary confinement, whether that be for punitive purposes or for their own safety. That was proven to be really successful. They had a morals and ethics class taught by another prisoner, and I wish that everybody could have sat in that class because nothing makes you reflect on your own morality like doing it with people who are incredibly honest about who they are because of where they are. They had calm down safe rooms that were therapeutic. People that were starting to spiral could go, and there's the sounds of the oceans and beautiful murals. And they were incentivizing getting your GED and doing programming and classes. So when I was working for DOC, Spring Creek was probably the safest prison for me to walk around in. Like, I never felt afraid in maximum security prison. And so I saw what was possible if we were just willing to try to do things a little bit different. And we were creating safer people, people that had a reason to wake up and be good and to try and work on themselves and be the best version of themselves. And so people were releasing safer people. And when it was in the tea leaves that all of that was probably going to quickly go away. It's no secret that Governor Dunleavy's first term was really spent campaigning on repealing all of these criminal justice reform measures.
SB 91, which had brought in the new way of doing things at Spring Creek.
Yeah, it was in that era. There was pretrial reforms, there was parole reforms, but when it was clear that was all going to be undone, I started to get really nervous and afraid for people.
There was pushback that SB 91 had failed.
Yeah.
And that crime had gone up and that people knew they could just get away with things. That was like the narrative on the street.
Yeah.
And I was not involved in just, that's what I heard. What was a legitimate complaint and what was illegitimate?
No, sure. I will say, whether it was in the mid-2010s when this bill was moving or today, our problem is that we spend money on people too late. And that is just the case of our correctional system. So,
or our society.
In our society, exactly. It's not just corrections. It's everything.
The homelessness problem.
Exactly. They're all interconnected. And I look at it today, and I look back on that time, and 80% of our incarcerated population today has a substance use disorder. About 60% has a mental health issue, and 55% has both, making Department of Corrections the largest mental health and substance use treatment provider in the state. That's a problem. If there's more services for treatment in a carceral setting than they are in the community, we're waiting too late. We're waiting for people to do harm before we give them access to treatment and stability and safety and healthcare. And that is terrible for our community. And it was the same in the SB 91 era. SB 91 was sold on, we're going to save money because we're not going to spend as much on prisons because we're going to let people out more. And we're going to invest more in substance use treatment and mental health. So SB 91 was implemented. And I think by the time everything got stood up and actually functional and repealed, it was like roughly a year. So it was hardly there. But we put the cart in front of the horse. The big complaint was really with the pretrial population because people were still suffering from addiction and mental health crises, and they were going into the system, they were getting released and put back into the street. Well, it turns out 2 days later, that addict that you sent to jail is still probably an addict because pretrial defendants really can't access drug treatment, and certainly not in 2 days. And so I think however you talk about SB 91, there's a really good lesson in what we can do better. And it's that we don't want prisons to be our catch-all. You can throw as much money as you want at the prison system, and it is still going to be a concrete box. It is not therapeutic at all. And maybe we shouldn't wait so much to invest in treatment and mental health. You shouldn't have to be charged with a crime to do that. And I think that was the big problem with SB 91 was we were letting pretrial defendants out who had these. This is also the peak
plan
of
was
opioid.
to invest in more mental health, more
Exactly.
But the part of the law that got implemented immediately was letting people out before they had any of that treatment.
Yeah, absolutely. And we were going to save the money, and then we were going to go back and we were going to build the services. And that's not a function. That's not a functional model.
Right.
And you also have to put things in like the context in which they exist. Like this was like the peak of the opioid epidemic. The whole nation is struggling with fentanyl. And there at the time, I was sat on an opioid task force. with every state agency. And there wasn't one state agency who wasn't being impacted by the opioid epidemic. There wasn't one community that wasn't impacted by it. But throwing somebody in a jail cell for a couple of days isn't going to make them any better. And you're not preventing anything from that model. You're just reacting to it once it happens.
So SB 91 gets repealed.
SB 91 gets repealed.
And you...
I briefly actually worked at BP. I was no longer employed by the state and was just like desperate for work. I got a contracting job doing internal communications for BP and never saw myself working for big oil, but I learned a lot while I was there about how to make things run efficiently and effective. Their whole thing was working smarter, not harder. And I took a lot of lessons away from that. And in the process, I just tried to appeal to the ACLU of Alaska to hire me because I felt like it was the only organization that sort of had a structure and a backing to keep addressing criminal justice reform issues. And it wasn't that hard to predict that the whiplash of the criminal justice reform era would be massive. We would be massively swinging back in time. And that's exactly what's happened. And there's a lot of consequences of that. That's how I got here.
And I believe that when you went to ACLU, the ACLU wasn't really working hard on this issue.
No, nobody was working on prisoner rights issue when I went to the ACLU, which I do think is why I was a little successful in appealing to them. Prisoner rights work is really complicated. It is, I don't want to get into a war of what sort of civil rights advocacy is harder, but it is really hard. First of all, you are working with a population of people that have 1,000,005 barriers in even talking to you. Getting records from the Department of Corrections is super challenging. They do much of their work behind this like veil of secrecy, so that's really challenging. And there's a lot of steps that you have to go through legally before you can even bring a case. And so no one was really like that eager to do prison work. And when SB 91 was repealed, everybody that was working on criminal justice broadly dispersed. Like they went back to the lower 48 when they lost their jobs with the state and they took jobs elsewhere. So there became this really big gap in services. There was no entity that was paying attention at all in what was happening in our prisons. And it is my belief that is a huge disservice. If you really want to understand what's happening in your community, spend 5 minutes in a jail and you'll start to see all sorts of things because there's nothing that's happening in a jail or a prison that isn't happening in our community. Our correctional system is just like a petri dish. So if you want to understand everything, there isn't an issue that like we don't work on, whether that be voting access and getting people ballots or access to health care. It's the same struggle. It's just in a different setting. But this is also a population of people that it's easy to ignore because they're out of sight, out of mind. You don't have to look at them when you're driving down Northern Lights. So you're not concerned at all about what's happening in our jails and prisons. But there are huge impacts of having such a massive system and having social structures that are set up to just send people right to jail. And yeah, the ACLU of Alaska really wasn't doing any. They were getting quite a few intakes from people in prison, but really just not addressing it. So I actually took a communications director job and spent the first couple of years I was there really advocating for this. And then I got staff buy-in and I got funding to get it going. And it's just...
And you created your own program, basically.
Created my own program, yeah.
If we were to prioritize what needs to happen to make the criminal justice system better in Alaska now?
I think my priorities right now is, and I have a laundry list of things I would like to work on under this umbrella. My priorities right now are access to medical care. The Department of Corrections has the responsibility of providing medical care to everybody in their care, and they're not doing an adequate job. They have a really hard job. I'm not going to downplay how hard their job is. Most of the people in DOC custody have never seen a doctor before, or they haven't since the last time they were in custody for the majority of people. And so I'm worried about people's health care. I'm interested in stopping deaths in custody. And also, I think it's just one of the most basic things that we can provide to people. And again, it's not like they can go to the doctor. They have to rely on this medical system. That's their only option, and it is woefully inadequate. So that would be one of my top priorities. And second to that's parole reform. We have an aging prison population that's costing the state a lot of money. And we do not have consistent and meaningful opportunities of release. And the parole board plays such an essential role in meaningful opportunities for people to go home, that making their jobs more clear, that the intent of a parole board is to evaluate whether or not somebody will be successful. And that's the authority of the parole board. And evaluating somebody's sentence or how much time they do is actually at the discretion of the judicial branch. That's, to me, an efficiency change that we can make. And it'll also add quite a bit of relief to the prison population. We have a growing population of people that are turning into old men. And when you look at DOC's budget and how they're spending money, a lot of it is for these like late in life medical costs. And if that person has a reentry plan, a safe place to go, they've proven while they're in prison that they can follow the rules and they can demonstrate that they have changed and they can be productive members of our society, why are taxpayers paying for that person? That money could be better spent in education. Parole is my second big priority.
Can you explain for listeners the difference between parole and probation?
So Alaska's system is set up different. Parole is usually for people that have much longer sentences. Probation is a little bit lighter on stipulations. There's more of a threat also if you violate your parole. We have a unified correctional system, and parole and probation are really not separated by much in Alaska. It's the same officers, and a lot of times, like, your stipulations
Look the same.
look almost identical.
I went to the courthouse yesterday and I watched some stuff, hearings, things happening. And I did watch some parole probation stuff happening and people who'd violated.
Oh, yeah.
And what I took away
Yeah.
from what the judge was saying and from what I was hearing was that there was no support being provided to folks who were on probation. And if you have no support being provided, the lawyer can make, their defense can make a pretty good argument that probation should be helping the person get better. It's not like a place to catch them doing something wrong. It's like probation should be there to make sure that they stay on the straight and narrow, and we're going to help you stay on the straight and narrow.
Absolutely.
Whereas that's not how it's functioning. And it was very clear that the judge knew that's how it wasn't functioning. There were questions from the judge about, were you provided any access to treatment? Did anyone suggest that you go to some AA meetings?
Yeah.
They're like, no, and my only interaction has been to provide a urine sample, or it was just...
I'm so glad to hear that in a court. I went to a reentry conference a couple of years ago, and it was about recidivism reduction. And there was this lady speaking from this organization called Just Leadership. And there's a lot of people in that room. There's activists like me. There are people who do reentry in that room. And there's also POs, probation, parole officers. And the lady from Just Leadership was talking to the POs, and she said something along the lines of, probation and parole officers look at success by how many people they bring back to jail. And she said, but what if success was measured by how many people you helped successfully and safely live in the community? Then what would your job look like? And I was like, yeah, totally. And that's actually what made me really start thinking about the changes that I want to make, I want to see happen on the parole board, with having a parole board that is designed to evaluate how successful you would be when you're in the community, not whether or not you did enough time, because that's not their job. They should be looking to see how successful you'd be at the community. So under that model, you'd have somebody who's a substance use expert. You have somebody who's a professional in psychology, sociology, a victim's rights advocate. You'd really have people with this expertise that could actually evaluate people for the things that they need. And it flips this idea of parole and probation. Yes, it is community supervision, but community supervision isn't how many times you've re-arrested somebody. Community supervision should be keeping the community safe, which means providing support to that person, that parolee, that probationer, to make sure that they're successful in the community. People who are coming out of prison have a laundry list full of barriers. The F of a felony is like the scarlet letter. It follows you absolutely everywhere. That alone is a problem. If you're convicted of a violent crime, it becomes a huge barrier in a lot of the jobs you could do. So that means that maybe you're working in like a fast food restaurant, which, like, good, you were employed, but who in this town can live on a minimum wage salary.
No one.
And yeah, exactly. And so it's like, how do we help make people better? There's a lot of people that go into prison without a substance use disorder and develop one while they are there. So those are now people who are going to hard time in the system, and they need to come to the community, and they need to have access to things. That whole time they were incarcerated, they were told what time to wake up, what time to eat, when they were allowed to go to the bathroom. And then you put them back in the community after however long they've spent there, and you wonder why it's hard for them to make a decision. I've helped people who are getting out of the community go to the grocery store and get some just like very basic household things after they got out. And they're looking at like the toothpaste aisle. And they're so overwhelmed because there's options. Like, which toothpaste do I pick? Because that was always chosen for them. And I love that this judge was asking about it, because I do believe that we would actually have a more well-functioning system if we looked at ways we were supporting people getting out of prison, not just looking for ways to send them back. And that's not that you don't hold people accountable. And the other thing that I think is really important to understand in how Alaska is set up is, I hear all the time, Alaska has one of the highest recidivism rates in the nation.
Do you know what our rate is?
66%. And most people going back. So we define recidivism differently than most places. Ours is any return to custody within the first 3 years of release. So the majority of that 66% are going back to prison within the first 3 months of release for many of the things that we just talked about. But comparing Alaska's recidivism rate to other places is also a little bit like comparing apples and oranges, because in Alaska, it's any return to custody, not necessarily a new crime. However, if you violate your condition of release, it's called a VCOR, that's actually a new crime. And you can get a VCOR for something that's actually not criminal in nature. Let's say
not meeting with your parole officer.
Yeah, not meeting with your parole officer. Or let's say that you rely on the bus because you can't afford a car because you just got out of prison, and the buses are running late to go downtown to your PO's office. You're late. That's actually a violation. They can remand you. And then now you have a new criminal charge. And sometimes those VCORs follow them longer than the original criminal charge. So when we get into revocations and violating conditions of release and even pretrial, these systems are so complicated.
I want to talk about pretrial.
Yeah.
I toured Anchorage Correctional Center. I toured Highland. I toured Goose Creek. I toured the farm. I've been to these places.
Been around.
Yeah. Goose Creek, I think it was 50% were pretrial. And as I understand, a lot of folks will spend 3 to 5 years in pretrial, and then they'll go to trial, and even if they're found guilty, they may have already served enough time.
Mm-hmm.
And then, like you were talking about earlier, about sometimes pretrial people not having the same access to services that folks who are actually serving an actual sentence or post-trial would have access to. So you end up with folks basically being in the holding pattern for years, and then going to trial, I assume being found guilty. If they're acquitted, I don't know. Are there examples of that?
Oh, yeah. I know people who have spent more than 5 years pretrial only to get to trial and be acquitted or have their case dropped. And how do you get that time back? How do you undo all those years that you just spent pretrial? You can't.
I'm very curious about those folks, because the narrative that's fed to me, as somebody who's not really involved, is that prosecutors only bring charges when they absolutely believe that they're going to get a conviction.
That's what they should do. Let me put it this way. I know good people that work in every piece of our criminal legal system. I know police officers that I adore and I think are good people. I know correctional officers and probation, parole officers, nurses in the correctional system, even the commissioner. Good people. I know great public defenders and nice people who work for the state's attorney's office. I don't think any system is functioning well. And that's not a slam on anybody who works in those systems. Most people go into public service because you want to do the right thing. I think that sometimes I sat in on a sex assault trial over the summer, and the gentleman had been acquitted, or there was a mistrial, his first trial. And so then we were back, and it was a very bizarro kind of case that I'll spare you the weird details of. But the prosecutor was not excited to have to bring this case again. And the judge, there was just some procedural things at the beginning of it. And the judge is, do you really want to have to bring this a third time? And he alluded to the decision wasn't really his. And that he didn't think it was a great case. And he didn't want to be there any more than she wanted to be there or anybody else wanted to be there. And so there's a lot I don't know about our criminal legal system. But from the places that I go, I don't think any system is functioning particularly well. And I think that people, whether they're prosecutors or public defenders or correctional staff or police officers or they're civil rights advocates like myself, I think the one thing we can all agree on is there's things that we should be doing a lot better here. And when it comes to pretrial, we all agree, I believe, that there are things that we could be doing a lot better.
Are other states doing it better? Are other states holding people for 5 years pretrial and then having them be acquitted?
So I talk to people all over the country about these issues. And when I tell them that more than 50% of our prison population is pretrial and it's taken 3 to 5 years to get to trial, but we have people that are saying pretrial for 13, their jaws drop. I've heard that we're worse than Mississippi. I've heard that we're worse than New York. That's not good. We have a significantly smaller population overall. And so I think that there's lessons to learn. When I heard that Mississippi was doing better than us, I about lost it because it was like, Mississippi is one of the historically worst prison systems in the world. And we're worse than Mississippi on pretrial. We can do better.
I want to talk about your first priority about medical care. It's probably not a surprise to you to know that when a legislator is touring a correctional facility, that they show off their healthcare facility. So I toured all the clinics at least at ACC, Highland, and Goose Creek. And I'm a healthcare provider, like outside the legislator. I know what a clinic looks like. They looked like good clinics. So the floor was clean. The exam room looked like any exam room that I would use at the urgent care that I work at. It looked decent to me. I met healthcare providers working in the facilities. They were friendly.
Yeah.
I could see one was dealing with a sore throat. One was dealing with someone who had hurt their ear. They seemed like run-of-the-mill complaints. But I acknowledge that I'm being shown something different. So I guess at the very least, what I can say is they have held clinics in these facilities. And they also talked about how they have people getting chemo. They have, sending people out of the facility to get chemo. Like, we don't think about inmates getting cancer, but everyone can get cancer.
They're people.
Yeah.
So there's a process. So if I have a medical issue, let's say I feel a lump in my breast, I have to file a grievance and give it to a correctional officer and say, I want to see medical. And then that officer, it will go through correctional officers who are not medical professionals. They'll decide whether or not it's worthy of me seeing a doctor. They could respond tomorrow. They could respond in 6 months. They could never respond at all. And it's likely that they'll deny me. I have seen on grievance paperwork telling people not to lie. I have seen people die after months of requesting medical care and not getting it because correctional staff thought that he is a liar. And it has fatal consequences. My question is, why does a correctional officer who's never been to medical school get to decide whether or not I'm worthy of seeing a doctor? No one's getting preventative care. And so for every year you do in prison.
Is that true? There's no preventative care? No one gets colonoscopies in prison?
You have to request them. And they're not a priority. And I know a gentleman who had a lump in his testicles for several years. It took him years to get to a doctor to have it examined. I know people who haven't actually seen medical in years, but if there's preventative care there, I have no idea what it looks like because I don't know anybody who's getting it. And don't get me wrong, I have all the love in the world for people who choose to do medical care inside of prisons. I truly believe that you are a special kind of person. You are working with such a vulnerable population that is always in crisis, always in flight or fight mode. And for you to choose to do it in a carceral setting, I have all the love in the world for that. That takes an incredibly strong person. But again, I go back to what I was saying before. It doesn't prisons are still a concrete warehouse. Like, they're not therapeutic at all. And there's so many people in. You toured ACC. How chaotic was ACC?
It was, I don't want to get in trouble for things I say. I personally never want to be held there.
Yeah.
I would say Goose Creek was completely different. Goose Creek was night and day difference. Goose Creek seemed functional. It seemed like there were good things happening there.
Yeah.
It seemed like that there was actually some rehabilitation happening.
Yeah.
I also know that we were told that the pretrial folks were treated differently, that there was a difference.
Yeah, so that's another big thing, actually, on just in medical care specifically. Pretrial folks have a different access to medical care. And the reason I brought up ACC was because, again, this is not on the staff. I think we have too many people in prison. ACC basically operates always in a crisis mode because they have a population of people who, a lot of them are just getting there. You have a revolving door, the people that are going to come in and out all the time. You have people that are in active withdrawal that are terrified to tell you that they're withdrawing because they don't want to be put in a version of solitary confinement where they have to poop in a bucket 3 times before they can get out. They have people that are also desperate and experiencing a lot of suicidal ideation, a result of their own mental issues and of also a circumstance, who also don't want to talk about the fact they have suicidal ideation because they don't want to go to SEG. You have people just don't know what the rest of their life is going to look like. Everyone is in this sort of crisis survival mode there, and providing treatment in a setting like that, I can only imagine, is incredibly hard, but that population is so full. So then you move people out to Goose Creek, but by moving people out to Goose Creek that are pretrial, you also create then a different sort of burden on the sentenced population.
And just to be clear, also, like if you move, so Goose Creek is in
Point McKenzie,
yeah. Matsu, it's a long drive. It's a long drive.
It's an hour outside of Wasilla.
If they have to go to court, for example, it's a long drive.
Yeah.
And the burden is on correctional officers or somebody to transport them.
Yeah.
And you've got this pipeline of people going back and forth.
Yeah, I think it's probably really chaotic to have to manage the population as it exists now. And that's whether we're talking about medical care or solitary confinement or too many people pretrial for too long. We have a lot of really complicated issues right now. And
when you said SEG, what did you mean?
Solitary confinement.
Okay.
Yeah, there's many names for solitary confinement.
Got it.
So SEG, segregation, is essentially the same thing. But, you know, I know how chaotic these systems are existing right now. And I wouldn't want to go to ACC. I don't want to go to ACC when I worked for DOC and the system was in a little bit of a different shape even. I still was like, I didn't enjoy going to ACC. But
it's a frightening building. I mean, I just can't believe that's like in downtown Anchorage. And there's that many people in it.
Oh, they're squished in there like sardines. There's too many people. And it doesn't matter where you're at. And they've all got complicated problems. I don't know anybody who is satisfied with the way this system is functioning. Let's take pretrial and how long it waits to go to trial. It's super shitty for the person who's wasting years of their life sitting pretrial without knowing what the rest of their life is going to look like. It's also horrible for the victims of crimes to have to wait that long to have their cases resolved.
100%.
Like, I can't imagine trying, like, all these years after I was raped to finally now go talk to it. I'm trying to move on with my life now. So there's nobody that is satisfied with this system as it currently exists. And I actually think that's an exciting opportunity because we tried this thing and it didn't work, and we should try something else now. And I think that we can. I think it's a very solvable problem.
How hard would it be to make other facilities function more like Goose Creek?
Hard. Goose Creek, when it opened, and I think it was about 2012, was a state-of-the-art facility. It had very advanced education programs and vocational training programs. And to be honest, like, you and I see Goose Creek very differently. I see it as one of our most problematic facilities, but But
that's what I saw. I saw their computer labs
100%.
And I saw like their campus with the basketball courts and walking through. And there was definitely a feeling when you were in the places where they stay, the mods.
Yeah.
It was completely different than ACC. It felt much more homey, and this is where they hang out. And
that's the difference between a sentence facility and a pretrial facility, just generally. I was always more comfortable in a sentence facility because there's some stability there, because people have to live there. It's not a temporary home. I'm here for a while, so it's in our best interest that we can all live cohesively together. And don't get me wrong, Goose Creek has actually a really rad superintendent right now who cares about the people in her care. It's just a beast of a facility. But how would you make other prisons function that same way? There is opportunity in other prisons. So going back to Spring Creek actually has a pretty big education space, vocational space, and they don't really utilize it. We could be utilizing that program space. I think in the technology and the infrastructure is just different because our other prisons are so old that it would cost a lot of money to redesign them. Look at Palmer. Palmer almost has no programming. They have very limited resources that are there. And because Palmer was empty when we put people back out there, we could have also had an opportunity to improve the facility. And we haven't. And I think it's to the detriment of the people out there. I do believe that there's like drug treatment and there's some religious programming, but they're really under-resourced when it comes to other opportunities. So it's a big lift.
When you talked about the amount of mental health issues and the lack of mental health treatment, do you have any vision for how to improve that?
To me, it starts really in our communities. Again, I go back to this. We're spending money too late on people. So a lot of the mental health services that DOC is able to provide are for people who are in active crisis. And then they also get the pipeline of people from API. They get the Title 47 homes. They're really in crisis mode. So they have this whole big population that needs mental health treatment. And they're really only able to provide that crisis level of care right now. And then they're also in this position where, let's take someplace, again, like Spring Creek or even Goose Creek, they're super far away from where anybody lives. So staffing them adequately for mental health care professionals is really challenging.
Could telehealth work?
I believe telehealth could work. I think they do some telehealth on a pretty limited basis, but absolutely. What you're going to run into there, though, I think is probably an infrastructure problem. Our prisons are designed to be technology dead zones. So prisoners can't get cell phones, but that's how they've been designed. So now as the world changes and we need to use technology to improve access to medicine, access to education, and things like that, it's going to be really tricky in our prison system. It's going to take some renovations of our prisons to make those actual functioning systems. But I do think we should expand in telehealth. There's a high need for healthcare in our system.
I'm super grateful for you being here today. Is there any last thing that we didn't cover that you think folks need to know?
I would just say that I hope people approach the criminal legal system with a sense of openness. And I hope there's work done on it during this legislative session, because it's this huge need that we all see that people seem a little hesitant to jump in and try and champion or want to speak out on. In the conversations I am having, people in every area can all agree that it's not efficient and that there's a better way of doing this. And so my hope is that we have these conversations during the legislative session, outside of session, and that there's this willingness to talk to each other.
And I guess as a legislator, because you talked about SB 91, and I think because it was such a drama for those years, there's no way we're going to do anything legislatively like SB 91.
Yeah.
But can we make major changes without doing major statutory change?
Absolutely. I get really really now when I look at bills that are just like big sweeping packages of stuff, because there was a lot of good in SB 91 that wasn't even the problem that got repealed. So no, I don't think that we need another sweeping thing. But what I would ask is that we're taking a real critical look at our budgets. To me, the prison system intersects with everything. We give a ton of money to the Department of Corrections, and we want
$400 million.
I think last year was $420 million, and I think when I looked at the governor's proposed budget today, it could be wrong, but I think it was somewhere around $480 million. So it's just growing.
A massive increase.
It's growing. And I think we should all be taking a really good look at budgets in every sector. When we're talking about education, how are we spending that money, and how are we spending too much money on prisons, and how is our prison system, which is taking
how
all this
many
money?
inmates do we have total?
About 4,500 now.
So we have 4,500 inmates and a $480 million.
Yes. I hope that we really take a critical look at these systems and we invest money in the people of this state before they end up in a jail cell. The most important step that we do is having a willingness to sit at the table with each other and figure it out. People are always like, how do you fix pretrial? How do you fix parole? How do you fix conditions of confinement? And there's these big dreamy answers. You want safer prisons? Change the culture of prisons. And there's things that you could do. But I think the first step is really being able to talk to each other. Prisons and the criminal legal system touches everybody. Whether or not you've been incarcerated, you have a loved one that's been incarcerated, crime in your community impacts you. If you are a woman in the state of Alaska, you think about the fact that it is so easy to be sexually assaulted. If you are an Indigenous person, your chances of becoming incarcerated are so much higher than everybody else's. We're all touched by this system. So if we know it's not working, let's just put some brain power together to try some new avenues to address these things. And I think a critical step is looking at the budget, but there has to be willing to talk to each other.
Hey, I have a really dumb question, but just having toured the facilities and the showers are like practically in the room with everybody, like, with like short curtain.
Yeah.
I assume so that guards have visibility on everything at all times. Where are people getting sexually assaulted?
Cells, bathrooms. We send a lot of young boys to jail in the state that don't look scary. They haven't finished puberty. So we put them in cells with people who have been predators. It's horrible. It happens in every prison. And to me, that's one of the things that I want to solve the most is reducing sexual violence inside of prison. Because if the goal is for people to leave prison better than they are, as a sexual assault victim, I'm going to say that allowing them to be sexually assaulted isn't making them any better. And that feels like something concrete that we should all agree on now. Sexual violence is bad. So it feels really achievable, but it's happening everywhere.
Is there an admission from DOC that sexual violence in prison is happening?
DOC they've had to publish how many reports that they've gotten. And they're woefully under-resourced in their ability to travel to these different prisons and do investigations. And so people will make complaints that they were threatened or they were sexually assaulted, and it goes into this like black hole, and then it becomes really hard to prove because it's like a he said, she said thing.
So it sounds like that we need to allocate more money towards investigating sexual assault in our prisons. We have to understand the problem.
What's interesting, actually, is the federal government would give us money to do that. All we have to do as a state is the governor has to provide assurances to the feds that we are trying to reduce sexual violence in prisons, and they will give us funding to do this work, but we have not provided assurances to the federal government for several years. And so I do believe that we are losing the funding that we've been getting to do this work.
Why? Why would we not?
That's a great question for the Department of Corrections or the governor's office.
Hey, last question. Do you have any books to recommend to people who might be interested in this subject and want to learn more?
Oh, absolutely. I would say The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander is a great place to start. Have you read it? As you roll across your office to your books, it's a great book. Have you read it, though?
No. I have it, but I haven't read it. That's bad, right?
You should absolutely read it. I got lots of books on my bookshelf that I haven't got to yet, but I think this is a really important book that puts things into context of why, as a country, we have this mass incarceration crisis, where we have so many children growing up with an incarcerated parent, where it's so hard to become employed after you get a felony conviction. That's absolutely, I think, one of the best books we can read to understand it. And then the book I actually read this year that I thought was like the most important was not specific to the prison system. It was called Fever in the Heartland. It's a newer book, and it's a little bit about the history of the KKK. But I was actually shocked when I was reading it of how many things that came out of the playbook of the KKK that we still use in processes in government and decision-making, or the way we make decisions now. So I would say those are like my top two books that you should read. The New Jim Crow and Fever in the Heartland should be required reading.
Megan Edge, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@akleg.gov or call 907-269-0123.